Imagine this, high above the cities, inside glass towers that touch the clouds, a few people sit behind glowing screens. They type a few numbers, and in that instant, trillions of dollars come to life. No printing presses, no gold vaults opening, just digits appearing in a digital ledger. That is quantitative easing, or QE, the quiet magic trick that rewrote the rules of money. It was advertised as a lifeline for the economy, but in practice, it became the largest wealth redistribution in human history, moving power upward. From the middle class to the elite few. Before we unpack how it happened, take a second. If you love discovering the truth behind money and power, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to see just how global this conversation about money really is. Now, let's rewind. Back to 2008, the global financial system was burning. Banks were failing one after another. Stock markets were in free fall, and millions of people were losing their homes, savings, and jobs. Governments panicked. The world's central banks, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, stepped in, not as observers, but as firefighters. Their weapon? Money creation on a scale the world had never seen. How the magic works. Here's QE in simple terms. Central banks buy government bonds and other financial assets from private banks. In exchange, they create new digital money, money that didn't exist 5 seconds earlier. The goal is simple on paper: flood the financial system with cash so banks will lend more, companies will invest, and economies will recover. It sounds logical: stimulate growth, prevent collapse, restart confidence. But in practice, something entirely different unfolded. Most of that freshly created money never left the financial system. Instead of reaching the real economy, the world where you and I live, it stayed trapped inside the walls of finance. Banks used it not to fund new businesses or build factories, but to buy stocks, bonds, and real estate. Investors' portfolios exploded. Ordinary wages didn't. Between 2008 and 2023, global central banks conjured over $25 trillion in new money through QE. Stock markets hit record highs. Housing prices doubled or even tripled in major cities. The number of billionaires skyrocketed. Meanwhile, first-time homebuyers were priced out. Renters faced record costs. Savers earned almost nothing. When central banks buy government debt, they make it cheaper for governments to borrow and spend. That might sound positive: more spending, more stimulus, but it also removes discipline. Politicians can run massive deficits without raising taxes. And who benefits most when spending fuels asset prices? The people who already own those assets. QE didn't just lift markets. It rewired capitalism itself. A new kind of capitalism. For centuries, markets were driven by risk and reward. Now, they move to the rhythm of central bank policy. The Federal Reserve hints at quantitative easing. Stocks rise. It suggests ending QE, markets fall. We no longer live under free market capitalism. We live under central bank capitalism. And beneath this lies a darker consequence: the distortion of value. By creating oceans of new money, central banks inflated the price of everything. Bonds became so expensive that their yields, the returns investors earn, dropped to record lows. Pension funds struggled to meet future promises. Insurance companies couldn't match payouts to policies. Retirees, once safe on savings, were forced to chase risky investments they barely understood. That's how QE became a stealth transfer of wealth. When asset prices rise, those who already own assets, property, stocks, business equity, become richer. Those who live paycheck to paycheck fall further behind. It's invisible, but devastating. Economists call it the Cantillon effect. New money always benefits those closest to its creation first: banks, corporations, and wealthy investors. By the time it trickles down to workers, prices have already gone up. The result? The rich grow wealthier without lifting a finger, while everyone else struggles to keep up. The millennial mirage picture. A young person today trying to buy their first home. In the early 2000s, the average house cost about 4 times the median income. Now, in many developed countries, it's 8 to 10 times higher. Did houses suddenly become twice as valuable? Of course not. Money just became cheaper. And QE made it that way. Corporations enjoyed the same privilege. Cheap credit let them borrow billions, not to innovate or hire, but to buy back their own shares. Between 2010 and 2020, American companies spent over $6 trillion on stock buybacks. That pushed share prices higher, inflated executive bonuses, and widened the gap between the people who work and the people who own. And let's not forget the biggest winner of them all, governments. When central banks buy their debt, governments can borrow endlessly. During the 2020 pandemic alone, the US borrowed over $3 trillion, nearly 15% of its GDP, at record low interest rates. QE made that possible, but that so-called free money always comes with a bill: inflation, the hidden tax paid by everyone else. The addiction of easy money. Here's where it turns chilling. Once QE started, there was no turning back. Every time markets stumbled, every time a recession loomed, central banks hit the same button: print. 2008 was just the beginning, followed by the Eurozone crisis, Japan's deflation, and the pandemic. QE became the default response, the morphine drip keeping a sick global economy alive. But like any addiction, each dose must be larger to have the same effect. We've reached a world where markets aren't allowed to fall, because if they do, everything falls with them: pensions, jobs, even governments. Central banks are trapped. Stop QE and markets collapse. Continue QE and inflation erodes purchasing power. Either path leads to fragility. This is the hidden cost of easy money. It didn't just inflate bubbles, it created dependency. The irony of rescue QE was supposed to prevent another Great Depression. Yet by concentrating wealth, inflating assets, and distorting risk, it may have set the stage for an even bigger collapse. By the mid-2000s, its effects were impossible to ignore. Central bankers, once viewed as quiet technocrats, had become the most powerful figures on the planet. Markets hung on every word they spoke. When Ben Bernanke hinted at policy shifts, Wall Street trembled. When Mario Draghi vowed to do whatever it takes to save the euro, billions of dollars moved in seconds. And when Japan doubled down on quantitative easing under Abenomics, it wasn't just a national policy. It was a global experiment in monetary manipulation. And that experiment is still running. But as central banks printed more and more money, something strange began to happen. Inflation didn't appear where economists expected it to, in groceries or fuel prices. Instead, it exploded quietly in assets: real estate, stocks, bonds, even luxury watches. Everything the wealthy owned began to soar. The cost of living for the rich skyrocketed, while ordinary families were told there was no inflation at all. That's because the official inflation numbers only tracked consumer goods, not the financial assets that define real wealth. What emerged was a silent storm: financial inflation, invisible to most, but devastating over time. A Federal Reserve study later revealed a brutal truth. By 2021, the top 1% owned over 32% of all U.S. wealth, while the bottom half held barely 2%. Before QE began, that gap was narrower. The message was undeniable: quantitative easing didn't close inequality, it supercharged it. And that raises a deeper question: was this a mistake or was it by design? Because when you look closely, the system seems built to protect capital, not labor. Central banks defend quantitative easing by claiming it boosts demand and prevents deflation. But every lever they pull works by inflating asset prices, not wages. By making borrowing cheap and saving worthless, QE pushes everyone to speculate, to gamble in financial markets, just to keep up. Now let's talk about who gained the most. Banks were the first and biggest winners. During QE, they sold government bonds and mortgage-backed securities to central banks, receiving trillions in fresh cash. But instead of lending to small businesses or consumers, they poured it right back into markets. Result: record profits, record bonuses, and even more consolidation. Giants like JP Morgan, Citigroup, and Bank of America grew larger than ever, while smaller banks slowly disappeared. Then came corporations. With interest rates near zero, borrowing became almost free, so they issued oceans of debt, not to innovate or expand, but to buy back their own shares. Between 2010 and 2020, Apple alone spent over $400 billion on buybacks. Across the S&P 500, more than half of corporate profits went the same way. That doesn't create jobs, it inflates stock prices and executive paychecks. And of course, governments became the next big beneficiaries. QE turned into their financial lifeline. The Federal Reserve now holds trillions in U.S. Treasury debt, meaning a large chunk of government borrowing was financed with money created out of nothing. It made deficits appear painless, enabling endless stimulus without immediate consequences. But those costs always arrive later, as inflation, currency debasement, and a widening gulf between Wall Street and Main Street. Meanwhile, investors who rode the QE wave saw once-in-a-generation gains. Hedge funds, private equity firms, and massive asset managers thrived. BlackRock's assets under management tripled during the QE decade. The number of billionaires doubled worldwide. For those with capital, QE was a golden era, but for ordinary people, it was slow suffocation. Wages stagnated. The cost of housing, education, and healthcare soared. Young people were told to invest early, yet most never had enough to start. Savers watched their returns vanish. Retirees saw fixed incomes eroded by inflation. Small businesses couldn't compete against corporations fueled by cheap debt. The supposed post-2008 recovery became one of the most unequal in history. The stock market boomed, but half the population owned no stocks at all. The illusion of prosperity hit a hollow reality, one where credit replaced productivity and speculation replaced growth. Then came 2020, the pandemic hit, and QE went into overdrive. The Federal Reserve printed more money in 3 months than it had during the entire 2008 crisis. Governments launched multi-trillion-dollar stimulus packages. For a while, it felt like relief. Free checks, cheap loans, markets surging again. But behind the applause, the same pattern repeated. By mid-2021, inflation began to roar. Supply chains got the blame, but the truth was simpler. Trillions of new dollars chasing the same limited goods. Housing reached record highs. Used cars doubled in price. Food costs climbed everywhere. After a decade of trying, central banks finally achieved inflation, but not the healthy kind. It wasn't gentle growth, it was chaos. And here's the twist. When inflation became unbearable, the same central banks that caused it turned around to fight it. They slammed on the brakes, hiking interest rates, crushing borrowers, and destabilizing markets once again. It was like lighting a fire, then selling the water to put it out. This cycle, boom, bust, bailout, has repeated for decades. QE didn't just continue it, it intensified it. The rich thrive in volatility, the poor drown in it. Every crisis now seems to make the system even more unequal. At this stage, you might wonder, if QE is so destructive, why not just stop? The answer is simple. The system can't survive without it. QE became the oxygen of global finance. Remove it, and markets collapse. Keep it, and currencies collapse. Either way, it's a trap. By 2023, global debt surpassed $300 trillion, the highest in human history. Governments, corporations, and households alike are addicted to cheap credit. Yet every new dollar of debt now produces less growth than before. Economists call it debt saturation, a polite term for borrowing from a future that's running out. The irony is painful. QE was supposed to buy time for economies to recover. Instead, it bought complacency. Politicians delayed reforms. Corporations chased short-term stock gains. Investors assumed central banks would always step in to save them. That assumption even has a name: the Fed put. The belief that the Federal Reserve will always rescue the markets has become the foundation of modern finance. But confidence, the very fuel that keeps this system running, is fragile. The moment people stop believing in the illusion of control, everything built on it can unravel overnight. We now live in a world where printed money props up asset prices but erodes social stability, a world where record wealth exists side by side with record debt, where economic stability depends not on productivity but on maintaining faith that the magic trick will never fail. And the truth about every magic trick, it always ends the same way, with a reveal. As we step into the modern era, quantitative easing isn't a temporary rescue plan anymore. It has become a permanent feature of the global economy, the default response to every crisis. Falling growth, print money; market panic, print money; political turmoil, more QE. What began as an emergency measure in 2008 has quietly transformed central banks into the most powerful, unelected institutions in history. But the real story isn't about interest rates or bond purchases. It's about control. QE created a world where central banks decide who prospers and who collapses. A single announcement from the Federal Reserve can add or erase trillions of dollars in global wealth. When the Bank of Japan buys stocks, it literally becomes part owner of private companies. When the European Central Bank purchases government bonds, it effectively finances governments directly. The lines between monetary policy and political power have blurred. This is the hidden truth. Quantitative easing has quietly transformed capitalism into something unrecognizable. A managed economy addicted to endless liquidity. Free markets can only exist when money has a price. QE destroyed that price. Think about what that means. Money is supposed to measure value, a reflection of what people produce, create, and trade. But under quantitative easing, money can be created without effort, without production, without limit. The link between work, value, and reward has been severed. That's why so many young people today feel like effort no longer matters. The system no longer rewards creation, it rewards possession. Those who already own assets thrive. Those who don't are left chasing an ever-fading dream. And this distortion doesn't stop at national borders. In emerging markets, quantitative easing in the United States often creates chaos abroad. When the Fed floods the world with cheap dollars, investors rush into places like Brazil, Turkey, or Indonesia seeking higher returns. Their currencies rise, exports weaken, and local economies overheat. Then, when the Fed reverses course and tightens policy, that same hot money vanishes, leaving collapsing currencies and crises behind. QE exported financial instability to the entire planet. It also reshaped geopolitics. The US dollar's role as the world's reserve currency gives America a unique advantage. It can print the money the world depends on. QE, in that sense, became a tool of global leverage. Foreign governments holding US debt rely on the dollar's stability controlled entirely by the Federal Reserve. That is power on a scale few empires in history have ever possessed. But even empires built on money eventually crack, and now the cracks are showing. Even central bankers themselves have started to question what they've created. Former Fed Chair Janet Yellen once admitted that QE was like using medicine with unknown side effects. Those side effects are no longer unknown. They're everywhere. Inflated markets, moral hazard, a public losing faith in fiat money itself. Because when every crisis is solved by printing more, people start to wonder what their savings are truly worth. The rise of Bitcoin, gold, and other hard assets isn't just speculation, it's rebellion. It's a collective recognition that traditional money is losing credibility. QE created wealth, yes, but it destroyed trust. And without trust, money cannot survive. History shows how this story ends. In Weimar Germany in the 1920s, the government printed money to pay its debts. At first, it worked. Markets calmed, jobs returned. Then prices began to rise. People started spending money faster, knowing it would be worth less tomorrow. Before long, inflation spiraled out of control. The middle class was wiped out. When money fails, society follows. Today's world is more digital, more complex, more global, but the underlying logic hasn't changed. Debt and money creation can delay pain, but they can't erase it. QE is simply debt monetization in disguise. Central banks buying government debt with money created out of thin air. On paper, it makes the debt disappear. In reality, it only hides the damage. Because debt always matters. The moment confidence breaks, the illusion shatters. So, what comes next? Some economists believe QE is evolving into its next phase: central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. Digital versions of national currencies that could give central banks near total control over money itself, where it goes, how it's spent, and who has access to it. Supporters call it innovation. Critics call it programmable control. Either way, it's the next step in the same story, using technology to manage what used to be free. Others believe QE won't end through reform, but through crisis. As debts grow and inflation returns, central banks will face a brutal choice: protect the currency or save the system. And history tells us which side they'll choose. They'll save the system. They always do. That means more printing, more inflation, and even greater wealth concentration. But the true cost of QE isn't just economic, it's psychological. It teaches entire societies that consequences can be postponed forever. That debt doesn't matter, that every collapse has a bailout waiting, but every delay only makes the reckoning harsher when it finally comes. We're now living in an era of artificial stability, a reality propped up by digital money, towering debt, and blind faith in technocrats who believe they can outsmart history. But history has never been kind to those who thought they could control it. Over 3 centuries of financial history tell the same story. Every era of excessive money creation ends the same way: devaluation, reset, or collapse. From Rome's silver coins to France's assignats to Weimar's marks, the pattern never changes. Easy money buys time, not prosperity. Quantitative easing is simply the modern version of that same ancient story, the largest, most complex, and most global wealth transfer in human history, from the many who earn money to the few who create it. And while the scale may be unprecedented, the outcome is entirely predictable because as central banks continue their experiments, one question remains: how long can a system built on confidence survive when the people no longer believe? Because make no mistake, another crisis will come. And when it does, the world will once again look to its central banks for salvation. But what happens when even they run out of tricks?